Welcome to Utilizing Innovation Configuration Maps to Engage in Reflective Practice, an asynchronous module, which is part of the Louisiana Department of Education's Acceleration in Mathematics Professional Learning series. If you have not already done so, please pause this module, grab a pen or pencil and something to jot notes on, and take a minute to download the resources that accompany this session. For this particular module, you may find it beneficial to print the resources out so you have a hard copy. You may be viewing this module for a variety of reasons, either as an instructional leader to build your own individual knowledge around how to support teachers, as a leader utilizing the module to facilitate a PLC with a small group of teachers, or as a teacher or group of teachers who are interested in growing professionally. Whatever your role or setting, the ultimate goal of all of the modules in this series is to provide you with tools and support you as you work to make the vision of LDOE's Accelerate initiative that all students can achieve high expectations regardless of their background, family income, or zip code a reality. Before we jump into the content of this session, let's take a moment to establish some community agreements. Look around you. Wherever you are, that is fine. If you're sitting at a school desk, on a lounger at home, or even sitting by the pool, that's the joy of these modules. You can come as you are right now in this moment. All we ask is that for this hour or so, that you focus on the learning and try to mute life around you. Learning doesn't end after a 1-hour video. It takes place over time. So take what you learned today and use it at your school. Invite others to a discussion over the material you see. Go back and watch this module or the others again once you've internalized it, and you'll see something more. Continue the learning, since learning is iterative. Finally, embrace the pause. There will be times during this video that you need to reflect on something or to try something out before moving on. This is why pause buttons were created. You are welcome to pause and rewatch this recording as many times as you need while you begin your journey of learning with us. So embrace that reflection time. Let's discuss what we will be accomplishing in this module. Through this module's asynchronous learning, you will explore tools that promote reflective practice by providing clear and actionable descriptions of mathematics teaching and learning, aligned with engaging in the formative assessment process to support implementation of acceleration in the math classroom. And then you'll identify practical next steps that will lead to sustainable change and, most importantly, impact student achievement. Reflective practice is the ability to reflect on one's actions so as to engage in a process of continuous learning. This module is based on some underlying assumptions of reflective practice for everyone in the LDOE system, including teachers and instructional leaders. Those assumptions are that everyone needs professional growth opportunities. All professionals want to improve and want to learn. And all professionals can assume responsibility for their own professional growth and development. We have to assume that people need and want information about their performance, and that collaboration enriches professional development. So hopefully you are watching this session with some colleagues, or you will be collaborating with them to reflect and identify your next steps. According to Hall and Hord's publication, Implementing Change, Patterns, Principles, and Potholes, change is a process. It's not an event. It's accomplished by individuals first and then systems. It's a highly personal experience, and it requires growth in both feelings and skills. When systems implement an innovation or a change, such as the implementation of acceleration in the math classroom, individuals may have different interpretations about what that change really looks like in practice. The different interpretations might range from an ideal state to forms where the innovation is hardly recognizable. We're going to be looking at innovation configuration, or IC maps, which are tools that help us better understand what a change should look like in its ideal state and what the continuum of behaviors may look like as users gain experience with implementing the change. You may be wondering why this module is specifically honing in on formative assessment to accelerate students in the math classroom. LDOE has identified 3 core pillars of acceleration: intentional structures, high quality materials, and effective instruction. If we dig deeper into that third pillar, effective instruction, we can see that formative assessment is a key component. I invite you to pause this video and take a moment to review the information on the slide. As you can see, formative assessment is key to accelerating learning. It is crucial to providing that just-in-time support so that all students can have timely access to on-grade level content, which will result in the highest academic return on investment. Let's take a moment to see what your interpretation of implementing formative assessment to accelerate learning in the math classroom looks and sounds like. In just a moment, I'm going to ask you to pause and create a T-chart similar to the one shown here, with a column for students and teachers. Then take some time to identify what you think it looks and sounds like when students are engaged in the formative assessment as part of acceleration in the math classroom and record it in the left-hand column. Then identify the corresponding teacher actions that would make that happen and record it in the right-hand column. Once you have finished jotting down your individual thoughts, if you are viewing this module with a team or in a PLC setting, take some time to share your observables with your colleagues. Go ahead and pause, set up your T-chart, and fill it in now. If you are in a team or PLC setting and had the opportunity to share your observables on your T-chart, you most likely had some different variations and interpretations of what formative assessment might look and sound like. An innovation configuration, or IC map, presents carefully developed word pictures of selected components of an innovation or a change and all the different operational forms that may exist. We know that a change or an innovation can assume several different configurations that encompass the ideal state envisioned by its designers and its different variations arising from all the different user interpretation and experiences. IC maps are descriptive documents that provide clarity by detailing what an innovation, like formative assessment, should look like in practice to ensure that all stakeholders are in alignment. These IC maps describe the how and what of an innovation, and they provide a way to understand the possible progression of behaviors. IC maps are for shared learning. They're valuable in developing a common understanding of expectations, identifying where additional support is needed, and encouraging self-reflection and self-assessment. Now let's see what these IC maps are all about. Grab those maps that you printed out at the start of the session. Pause this module and take a minute to briefly scan over them and see what you notice and wonder just about the structure of the maps. You will have time to look at them more deeply in a moment. So go ahead and pause now. Let's talk about the structure of the maps. First of all, you probably noticed that there are actually two maps, one to clarify teaching and one to clarify learning. This is because we know that students are at the center of everything we do, and our end goal is to impact their achievement and engagement in math as mathematicians. So we should be reflecting on those observable student behaviors that are taking place in the classroom. But we also know the only way we are going to see those desired student behaviors is if teachers are growing in their practice. So we definitely need to reflect on the teacher behaviors as well. Each map has several different parts. First, we have the component. In this case, it is engaging in the formative assessment process. Then we have dimensions, and these dimensions are identified just to give a little more clarification to the component. Finally, the largest portion of the IC map is made up of the variations. It's these variations that describe the how and the what of the innovation and provide a way to understand the progression or continuum of behaviors. This is where teachers can pause and reflect on their current practice and compare it to the ideal teacher and student behaviors in order to pinpoint areas for growth and identify specific goals and actionable next steps to move along the continuum through small wins while always working towards that ideal state. We can use the metaphor of ice cream to give us a little more clarity to the structure of the variation part of the IC maps. The far right of a map is like a scoop of plain ice cream. Ice cream is nice, we have something to work with, but we could make it a little better. It's an entry point, if you will. As we move along the continuum to the left, we can bump it up with some hot fudge, but we could still add more and improve this sundae with some whipped cream as we move farther across the left of the map. Finally, the goal we are always working towards is that ideal state where we've got it all going on with the ice cream, fudge, whipped cream, sprinkles, and even a cherry on top. At first glance, you may have thought the IC maps looked like a rubric, but in addition to noticing the difference in the meanings of the levels, it's also very important to note that IC maps are not intended as evaluative tools. Instead, IC maps are for shared learning. They are means to assess and measure the various forms of innovation implementation while promoting reflection, informing goal setting, and identifying next steps. Let's take a look at another quote from the LDOE that defines acceleration. Take a moment to pause and read this quote to yourself. Now we are going to dig deeper into the content of our IC maps using the lens of this quote. As you read through the variations on the clarifying teaching and clarifying learning maps, see if you can identify any connections between the ideal state on the maps, so that state on the far left, and acceleration as described in this quote. Also, see what you notice about the variations across levels. Go ahead and pause now as you compare the descriptors in the ideal state to the quote on the slide. Here are some of the connections that you may have noticed between the ideal state on the IC maps and acceleration as described in the quote. At the heart of acceleration is the idea of engaging students with on-grade level content by building off of their current knowledge and connecting it to skills in current lessons. When looking at the first two bullets in the ideal state of our clarifying teaching and clarifying learning IC maps, we can see that teachers and students who are in that ideal state are making connections between prior learning and current grade level learning goals and engaging in discourse around those connections and goals. In acceleration, formative assessment and diagnosing student understanding are utilized to support students in accessing on-grade level content. In our next two bullets, we see that the connection to the quote as both teachers and students are eliciting, attending to, and interpreting evidence of student thinking as a means of assessing for learning, rather than utilizing the data as a reason to delay on-grade level content. An acceleration model is all about taking an asset-based approach to supporting students with overcoming barriers by providing just-in-time supports that allow students timely access to on-grade level content. We can clearly see a connection between that just-in-time support in the fifth bullet, which describes teachers as responding in the moment to move students forward, while students are asking and answering, clarifying, and advancing questions in response to the reasoning of others, which demonstrates that the contributions of all learners are valid. Finally, the asset-based mindset of acceleration requires that we as teachers look at supporting students as an opportunity to build off of and leverage what students do understand about the content. In the ideal state, this means that we will see teachers using misconceptions as an opportunity to deepen students' understanding and reasoning, which promotes student self-engagement in self-assessment of progress towards learning goals. It is important to note that a teacher can be in various levels across the variations at the same time, which can help be more specific in identifying areas for growth. For example, a teacher may be eliciting evidence of student thinking and reasoning that is focused on goals, but that teacher also may be immediately rescuing or correcting the student errors. By looking at the adjacent levels that are closer to that ideal state on the left, teachers can reflect and identify goals and needed support to work more towards that ideal state, whether that is through professional development trainings, coaching, or peer observations. It's also important to keep in mind that IC maps capture a snapshot in time, so you really can only reflect on what happens during the snapshot. You may only see or implement a few of the variations in one classroom visit or lesson. So let's take a virtual classroom visit to make sense of how these maps could be used. Imagine you and your colleague have been engaging in some professional learning related to formative assessment. Specifically, Your colleague has focused on attending to and interpreting evidence of student thinking and addressing the range of student understanding, including misconceptions. And your colleague asked you to pop in her classroom during your planning and give some feedback on her implementation of her learning. Before we visit the classroom, I just want to point out that this is actual video footage from a classroom. We know that as teachers, we want to take an asset-based approach when we give feedback to build on strengths. This short clip is just a snapshot. And remember, the focus of this visit is on attending to and interpreting evidence of student thinking and addressing the range of student understanding, including misconceptions. While visiting this classroom, take notes on the teaching and learning you observe. Feel free to pause or rewind at any time.
The next step I'd like you to do is, I'm not necessarily going to reveal any information to you just yet, but I'd like you to now think about what would be a low estimate of how many sugar cubes would fit in this sugar cube container. What would be a high estimate on how many sugars could fit into this container? And then what would be a reasonable estimate? Okay, so on your handout, you're going to see right below the word estimate, there's a box where you can record a number for low estimate, a box where you can record a number for high estimate, and then you can place your estimate on the number line according to where you think it's going to go between the two. Okay? All right, so go ahead and have that discussion with your group, and I'm interested to see what you guys come up with.
25 is 25 cubes. Have you seen 25 sugar cubes?
But think of the width. Because they could probably pack like 10 of them. Boom, boom. That's already 20. 100's definitely higher than this. Alright, let's go with 20 then. Maybe a reasonable one would be about 50.
Yeah, around 50 would be. So about like
For sure.
50 is closer to 20 than 100. Wait. Yeah, 30. And then, so it should be a little bit more like over here. Instead of like right in the center, it should be like a little bit over here like this.
I'll pick up 50 or 5.
So 20 is a low, so you're saying if you double that, it's going to be a high estimate.
I would say 500 for this. I feel like there's gonna be like.
Well, looking at that image, how tall do you think that box is going to fit with sugar cubes?
If you look at the sugar cube, it's tiny. This big.
Right, so how many do you think, if we were to stack them up, how tall do you think that would be? Do you think it would be 453 tall?
Yeah, because one.
I think 400 stacked up is going to be a lot larger than this.
Yeah, but one cube weight.
How many cubes would be half?
Like 200. And no, half is like.
Because Ava, look at the cubes.
So I think
So it's not here.
like
So how much would be about half?
30. 60 or 35.
For half?
Like 35? No, 35 would be like less than a quarter.
I think you guys are not reasoning through what you see. Because if you notice, one cube goes about here, so how would it be about half?
5 cubes.
Okay, that's a better estimate than 30. So if you were then to double it,
That'll be 15.
that'd be about
10.
10, because 5 times 2 is 10, as far as the height goes. So
Oh.
reasoning through your different measurements, you can kind of get something that's high. Now I agree, 500 would be a high estimate.
That's like at least.
Right, would be okay, because it's an extreme estimate. So now what do you think would be a reasonable number?
50.
Okay. 50. Okay. If we
Because that's probably gonna be the lowest.
why?
Because the cubes are small. thinking like 50.
Okay, so you think you can fit more cubes than 10?
I was thinking like there's 4 going this way for how.
The width, is that what you're describing, like going back?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's at least 4 is the width.
And then going up is at least 8 or 10.
8 or 10. So if your high is at least 8 or 10, you know that's a pretty low estimate. Okay. And you guys have 90 as your high estimate. So how many cubes do you think are actually in the box?
30.
30?
Around about
30. Okay. So 30 is half of 60. So I like that you put yours in between on that number line accurately. So where do you think 30 would go on this number line, since you use 90 as your high?
About like right here.
Right, because 30 is a third of 90, so I agree with you on that. You have 60?
Yeah.
30 is half of 60.
Yeah, it's closer to 90. He said that his high.
Group 5. Can you guys give me the estimate that you decided to go with on how many cubes would go into the box?
The reasonable one, lower high.
The reasonable one.
Oh, 60.
60? Okay. Is there a reason, like a strategy you guys used for why you decided 60? Because I know we can say, oh, I eyeballed it. Well, what on there kind of helped you decide that 60 would be kind of reasonable?
Small the cube is.
Okay, so maybe how small the cube is?
And we don't know how wide it is.
Okay. So how many cubes do you think creates the width? Just based on the short snippet I showed you.
About 2, 3.
2 or 3, okay. So taking 2 or 3 and starting from there with your height or your width, okay. All right, group 4, what was your reasonable estimate?
65 for me and
65?
Izzy, and then he had 50 white. Yeah.
So 50 to 65?
Yeah.
Okay, group 3? What would your reasonable estimate be?
Well, at first we said 60, but now we say 100.
Okay, so maybe in between 60 to 100. All right, group 2?
We 20 to 90.
What was your middle estimate, your reasonable estimate?
55.
55 or 50? And group 1? 30? All right.
Now, use your notes and the Clarifying Teaching and Clarifying Learning IC maps to take an asset-based approach as you consider the following questions. What variations on the IC maps are observable? What evidence from the classroom visit and language from the variations on the map supports your thinking? And what might this teacher set as goals or next steps in working towards that ideal state? If you're in a PLC or team setting, have a group discussion and debrief on your responses. Remember, you can rewind and watch the video as many times as you need to. And also keep in mind, this teacher is working on attending to and interpreting evidence and addressing the range of student understanding and misconceptions. Go ahead and pause now. So now let's use the IC maps to debrief on what you observed. First, we will debrief on the clarifying teaching. Keep in mind that the teacher was really focusing on attending to and interpreting evidence of student thinking and addressing the range of student understanding, including misconceptions. So we're really going to hone in on the bottom portion of the map to identify the variations we observed and some of the evidence in the classroom that aligns with those variations. So keeping in mind that this map moves from far right, which is an entry point, and moves closer to the far left at the ideal state, it helps if we start from the far right of the map to identify what we did observe. We definitely saw the teacher addressing student errors in some way, specifically when we saw her spend time with the group that had estimated that the height would be 450 sugar cubes tall. So let's look at the variation one column to the left. She wasn't just correcting the error, it was more than that. She was starting to attend to and filter the table's misconceptions through her questioning. So let's move along the continuum. In looking at the next variation, moving closer to that ideal state, we see that a teacher that's in this column would be attending to and interpreting evidence of student thinking with the purpose of assessing their methods, their understanding, and their reasoning. When thinking back to the video, specifically with the table group who had that estimate of 450 sugar cubes, was the teacher really assessing what the students' methods and reasoning were? Or was she using questioning to guide them to her reasoning? And when she was collecting the estimates from each table group, group 3 shared that they started at 60, but changed their estimate to 100. But do we know why? There was no follow-up eliciting of evidence to really identify what their methods and reasoning were. So based on our very quick classroom visit, it appears that at this moment in time, the teacher was in the third column from the right, working towards that fourth column. Let's look at addressing student understanding, starting at the first variation we see moving from the right. Like we already discussed, we did see the teacher responding to misconceptions with some prompts and questions. But there were also some missed opportunities, specifically to bring in some manipulatives to help students reason through their estimates and deepen their conceptual understanding. So based on what we observed, this teacher is also in the third column from the right when it comes to addressing misconceptions. So based on the clarifying teaching IC map, what might this teacher set as goals or next steps in working towards the ideal state? Well, it seems like this teacher can start going further with interpreting evidence, going beyond just identifying misconceptions, but really using those misconceptions as an opportunity to dig deeper into student understanding. Why does that misconception exist? What understanding does the student have that resulted in that misconception? Which goes right along with addressing those misconceptions. Perhaps this teacher could start anticipating student misconceptions and plan for specific questions and supports, such as manipulatives, that could advance their learning and provide that just-in-time support. As next steps, this teacher could reach out to a math coach or math content lead to ask for additional support in anticipating those misconceptions and planning for how to respond. Or the teacher could ask teammates for ideas on how this could be incorporated into planning. Let's see what we observed on the clarifying learning map. Again, because we're focusing on attending to and interpreting evidence of student thinking and addressing the range of student understanding, we can hone in on that bottom portion of the IC map. Again, let's start by looking at the variations farthest to the right. We definitely saw students in pursuit of the answers or methods, but they weren't just asking for them. So let's move to the left and see if there's a variation more in line with what we observed. We did see students responding to the methods of others, whether it was the method of the teacher or a classmate, but we didn't necessarily hear students asking each other clarifying questions. Let's move along the continuum towards that ideal state. We did see students make revisions to their answers in response to their classmates, but it wasn't really clear whether or not their method and understanding were revised or just their answers. To that end, we didn't observe students adjusting their explanations or arguments. Let's go back to questioning. We already established that we saw students responding to the methods of others by refining their answers. But the students themselves weren't really asking any clarifying or advancing questions. As far as self-assessment of progress, even though we didn't blatantly hear conversations around self-assessment, we could argue that students who changed their responses were self-assessing their progress towards the learning goals. But there really wasn't any justification of that progress. So it seems like we observed the students mostly in this third column of the IC map, which makes sense, since that is where the variations that we observed for clarifying teaching lied as well. It seems like some additional next steps now that we could have looked at from clarifying learning could be modeling how to ask classmates clarifying and advancing questions, or maybe providing students with questioning stems. Additionally, this teacher could strategically pause to ask students about their perceived progress towards their learning goals. Now that we have explored our set of IC maps a little more, what are the different ways that these tools could be used to promote reflective practice? As we've already started to explore in this session, these maps could be used for goal setting, either as an individual or for shared goal setting with some sort of coach or leader. We looked at using them for identification of next steps, and they could also be used as a way for peer to focus their classroom visits. They can help to narrow down and identify professional learning needs or to reflect on the implementation of professional learning that's already occurred. They're a great tool for coaches and leads to really focus their support. They can be used for providing informal feedback and to clarify classroom observations. The key, though, is that these IC maps are a reflective tool intended for shared learning, never meant to be used as an evaluative tool in any way. So keeping in that vein of reflective practice, let's close out our session with an intentional pause to reflect on your own instructional practices. Take a moment to consider a lesson that you recently facilitated. What variations from the IC map do you think were exhibited? What are some focused goals you can set? What actions will you take to reach those goals? Go ahead and pause this recording to refer back to the IC maps and jot down your reflections. Thank you for taking that time to reflect and for engaging in this asynchronous module. Please feel free to revisit this recording as often as you like and take back this information and resources from this session to share with your team. Additionally, you can visit the sites on this slide for additional information regarding LDOE's Accelerate initiative, as well as for some planning resources.